29 words a day for 2 years straight. That comes out to 21,506 words that I learned over the last 2 years. Now, they weren't all for one language. They're spread out across 8 languages that I study each and every day. If you don't know already, those languages are Spanish, German, Japanese, Mandarin Chinese, Teochew, which is a Chinese language, Korean, Arabic, and Sanskrit. And so I wanted to go over some of the aspects of learning that many words in that period of time. It is a lot of words, I realize, and words are something that are very important when you're studying a foreign language, because if you don't know the vocabulary, you don't know what people are saying. You don't know what you're reading in the book. You don't know what's going on in the television program or the TV show you're watching. So, yeah, words are something that you cannot avoid. You have words and you have grammar, but I find words are the bigger block to understanding, because even if you know the grammar perfectly, if you go through a text and you point out, oh, I know this is in the present tense, I know this is in the past tense, I know that this is from the first person, that's from the second person, you don't really get a sense of the meaning. Whereas if you know the vocabulary, like you know that this means, oh, it means restaurants, waiter, order, food, eats, that gives you a better understanding of what you're trying to read. So yeah, words are very important, and let's go over how I was able to learn so many words in such a short period of time. So what was my process? The basic process looked like every day I would read in order to mine new words. So I would read books, usually on the computer. And the reason for that is because on the computer, I can analyze the text using websites like Migaku, Migaku.com, or Vocabtracker, Vocabtracker.com. And what these websites do is they give you the definition of the word just by clicking on the word in the text. That's the first good thing that they do. The second good thing that they do is that they auto-generate a flashcard for you using that unknown word and giving you the definition. With Migaku, they even give you the audio for it, as well as a picture to help you remember it. It's really great. So my process is I read using one of these tools. When I find an unknown word that I want to learn, I click on it. That way I can see the meaning. And then it auto-generates a flashcard into Anki, which is a flashcard program. It's a spaced repetition system program. So once I have the flashcard in Anki, that's when I can begin to learn the word and review it. So I make sure I go through all the reviews for that day that are up for that day, as well as I try to get in cards that are new so I can continue to learn new vocabulary. The way that I learn the words, because to be frank, I cannot just learn 29 new words every single day just by seeing them and seeing the meaning in English and maybe saying them back and forth a few times. It just doesn't work for me that way. My memory isn't that strong. So what I do in order to remember the vocabulary is I use mnemonics. I use mnemonic images to help me remember the words. And I'll go over mnemonics a little bit later in this video, because I'm going to go over first some questions that people had for me that I hope to answer. So how did I choose the words that I studied? So when I went through the text, I would look for words that I didn't know and I would choose those. Now, some people, they choose only words that are more common, which I think is a good tactic when you're just starting out. However, for me personally, I know in these languages I want to get to a very high level. I want to know between 30 and 50,000 words in each language, which means that pretty much every word that I come across in the text, I want to learn for the long term. So when I come across any unknown word, I look up the definition and then I auto-generate the flashcard immediately so that I can study it later. So basically, any unknown word that I come across in my reading, I study that word later. Now, how long did it take to do all this? Well, the great thing is that with a site like Migaku or Vocabtracker, to create the flashcard in Anki, it takes literally a second. You just click on the word and it auto-generates the flashcard for you. And I like this a lot because it takes away a lot of the administrative work of creating flashcards. I feel like I don't want to waste my time making flashcards, even though I could probably make slightly better flashcards than the ones that Migaku and Vocabtracker auto-generate. But I just don't want to spend time making flashcards because that's less time I have for actually engaging in the language and actually learning new vocabulary. So how long it takes usually depends on the language itself. For Spanish, because I already have a very large vocabulary, I might have to go through many pages of text just to get a few new words. But in a language that I've just started more recently, like Arabic, in one session, in one 30-minute session of reading, I could probably get 200 or 300 new words, depending on the text. So it really depends on the language and how many words I already know. The actual generation of the flashcards, like I said, is very fast. And then probably the part that takes the longest is the review, because just learning the word at first is very quick, but then you have to spend a lot of time afterwards reviewing and reviewing and reviewing to get into your long-term memory so that you don't forget it. So how did I review and retain the words? Basically, I use Anki. Every day I open Anki and I go through all the flashcards that are up for review that day. Now, when you review your vocabulary, you don't have to use Anki. You could just read the text again, you could read the book again, you could go through old material. However, I like to use Anki because I outsource the amount of time it takes to show me the reviews, as well as the fact that Anki has an algorithm where it shows me the cards at the interval it thinks is best for me getting into my long-term memory. Because if you review the word too soon, and you review it a few times too soon, you might forget it over the long term if you don't review it later. Whereas if you wait too long in between reviewing the word, you might forget it in between the review interval. So Anki tries to maximize the amount of time use you use to learn new vocabulary. And like I said, the way I retain the words is I use mnemonics, visual mnemonics, and I'll get to that in a moment. So did I encounter any challenges? I would say the biggest challenge is just the time factor, because to go through 29 new words a day actually doesn't take that much time. If I have the mnemonic, it usually takes 10 seconds to learn a new word. So what takes up the most time is probably the review, because if you're adding 20 new 9 words to your vocabulary to Anki every day, the number of reviews that pile up over time gets really high. So you might have to review like 100 cards in a day just to keep up with the reviews. Now, I should also mention at this time that the 29 words a day is an average. There were days where I was very, very busy, and although I did study the language, I was unable to learn new words. However, there were other days, I do remember, for example, when I was on an airplane, I must have gone through like 200 or 300 new words in Spanish. So the average that I worked out to was 29 words a day over 2 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I learned 29 words each and every day. So what were the results of this? The results of this were that I learned 21,509 new words across 8 languages over 2 years. And does that mean that I know every single word 100%? Could I use them off the tip of my tongue at any point? Probably not, because some of those words I learned just a week ago, and I'm still getting them into my long-term memory. I still need to practice conversation. I need to practice getting them into my active use from my passive understanding. However, the words that I learned earlier on, for example, 2 years ago, those I probably know pretty well. Those I've reviewed a fair number of times. They're probably in my long-term memory. I probably recognize them pretty quickly, and I can also use them in real speech or when I'm writing, whatever it may be. So how do I stay motivated? Because I admit, learning 21,506 words over 2 years or 29 words a day, that's a lot of words. It's a lot of vocabulary. So the way I stay motivated is I try to get a good study session in as the first thing I do in the day. Now, it's not the very first thing I do in the day, because the very first thing I do in the day is I meditate for 45 minutes. But after I meditate for 45 minutes, I have my breakfast, and then I begin to study during that time. Now, I study for an hour, and during that hour, I'm usually doing reviews, as well as adding new words to my vocabulary that I had mined previously when I went through a reading session and I auto-generated the flashcards. So the way I stay motivated is I just do it as the very first thing, or one of the very first things I do in the day. So no matter how busy I am or how tired I get later on, at least I had that fresh 1 hour in the morning that I can get through, and that way I have my best effort, my best mental strength, and I can really use that into learning the words and reviewing them. So now let's get into mnemonics, because I feel mnemonics are very powerful. Without mnemonics, there's no way I could have learned this many words. And what I decided to do was, I decided to go through 3 examples of mnemonics from words that I actually mined from my Anki decks. And what I did was I used ChatGPT to generate the visual mnemonics that I'm about to give you. So the reason I did that was to show you that you don't need an imagination, although I often use my own imagination to make the mnemonics. Sometimes I also use ChatGPT to get ideas if I'm stumped or I want to find a better mnemonic to memorize the vocabulary. But I'm going to show you can use ChatGPT, so you don't need visualization, you don't need imagination. You can just use ChatGPT if you want. So the first word is an Arabic word, and it's fajr, which means dawn or daybreak. So how do you remember fajr means dawn or daybreak? And the image that ChatGPT gave us, the mnemonic that it gave us, was imagine the sun rising and melting the fudge into a beautiful river of fudge. And you can imagine the sun rising and the heat radiating from the sun causing the fudge to melt into a river of fudge. Now, the word is fajr, so it's fajr with an R sound at the end. So I like to think of river, but instead of river, it's fajr. So it's like a fudge river, a fajr. So that's another way you can kind of fit the English words or meanings into the Arabic word, because obviously English is a different language than Arabic. It has different sounds, different combinations. You can't find an exact fit or match, but the point is to find an approximation. It has to be close enough that it can trigger in your head the memory of the actual word fajr, and then you can remember it that way. So you want to think of the sun rising during the dawn or daybreak. So when I say dawn or daybreak, you think of fajr. You think of the sun rising because it's the dawn, it's the daybreak, and you think of it melting the fudge into a river, and you get fudger. So when I say dawn or daybreak, you think fudger. The next word is a Japanese word, which is Migaku, which means illiteracy or ignorance. So the mnemonic image that ChatGPT gave us was, imagine a mug with a gecko inside it. So you have, the word is Migaku. So you have a mug and a gecko, Migaku. Again, gecko is not exactly like gaku, and mug is not exactly like mugaku, but it's close enough that it is an approximation that triggers the memory in your head for that word. So you want to imagine a mug with a gecko inside it, and the gecko looks confused because it's sitting on a blank book, indicating ignorance. So you want to think of ignorance from a blank book, reinforced by a gecko looking confused. So you have a gecko in a mug containing a gecko looking confused on a blank book, representing ignorance. So when I say ignorance, you think Migaku, which is a mug with a gecko. So I say ignorance, you think Migaku. Now the third last word is a Spanish word, and it's brasas, which means embers. So this time ChatGPT actually gave two mnemonics because sometimes it gives you two responses and asks you to choose the better one. However, both the responses were pretty similar. It said to imagine a brass pot or a brass saxophone, because brasas sounds like brass. So you imagine a brass pot or a brass saxophone glowing red hot with embers inside of it glowing brightly. So I think the interesting thing about this is you have to be careful about what you focus in on the mnemonic image, because if you think of a brass pot and you try to remember the mnemonic later, you might not remember brass. You might think of just pots, because pots is a stronger visual image. And there's ceramic pots, there's steel pots, iron pots, but you really need to focus in on brass, because brass is the key to remembering brasas for embers. So you want to remember a brass pot, or I think probably the image of a brass saxophone works a bit better, just because saxophones I think are made of brass. I'm not sure about that, but you can think of the image of embers inside of a brass saxophone, and that's how you remember that brasas means embers. So when I say embers, you think brasas. So that's basically how I use mnemonics to learn foreign language vocabulary. And it's quite useful, it's quite good, and I've had a lot of success with it. It does require a little bit more work up front, because you have to figure out the mnemonic image, you have to remember the mnemonic image, but in terms of remembering it for the long term, I feel like it's a time saver. So let's do a little quiz to see how well you remember the mnemonics. If I say dawn or daybreak, can you remember what that word is in Arabic? Do you remember the Arabic word for dawn or daybreak? The answer is fajr, which was the image of a fudge river, the sun rising at daybreak and melting the fudge into a river. Now, can you remember the Japanese word for ignorance? Do you remember how to say ignorance in Japanese? The answer is Migaku. And the image for this was a mug with a gecko inside it looking confused, sitting on a blank book, indicating ignorance. Okay, the last word is, can you remember how to say embers in Spanish? Do you know the Spanish word for embers? And the correct answer is brasas, which the mnemonic image was a brass pot or a brass saxophone glowing red hot with embers inside of it. So if you remembered the foreign words just then, you can see how mnemonics work. If you didn't remember it right off the tip of your head, then you probably will remember it now that you've been reminded of the mnemonic image, and next time you'll probably get it. So that's basically my process. I use mnemonics to learn the foreign vocabulary, and yeah, I hope that helps you. If you found this useful, then I would strongly consider subscribing to the channel because, hey, it's free and you might learn something that speeds up your progress to fluency, and wouldn't that be great? Okay, I hope this helped. Thank you so much and good luck with your studies.